Hello everyone, thank you all for joining us today for our third and final day of the 3-day third-party risk management bootcamp. We hope you found the last 2 days of the bootcamp valuable, as we've certainly covered a lot of third-party risk management material. My name is Jessie Redmond and I will be your host. On your screen you should see multiple widgets that you can use. If you're not familiar with our webinars or have not been on any of the bootcamp days so far, all the widget boxes are resizable and movable, so feel free to move them around to maximize your screen space. At the bottom of your screen in the toolbar are icon buttons you can use to show and hide those widgets. You can expand your slide area or maximize it to full screen by clicking on the arrows in the top right corner of the widget. If you experience any issues or have technical questions, you can use the Help widget or submit them along with any other questions through the Ask Question widget. We keep track of all questions throughout each session, so you'll hear us answer some live, but those that we can't get to right away, we will address with you via email. Before we get started, let's recap a bit of what has happened thus far in the bootcamp. On day 1, we briefly covered the third-party risk management lifecycle and its main 3 stages to set the stage for the entire 3 days of sessions. Hillary Dewhurst, Minder's head of third-party risk education and advocacy, kicked off our vendor onboarding sessions by speaking to the planning and risk assessment component in more depth. Then we dove into the due diligence process and expectations during vendor onboarding, and Kelly Vick, president at VendMinder, wrapped us up discussing contracting and its importance before partnering with a vendor. On day 2 of the bootcamp, Lisa Mayhill, VendMinder's Director of Information Security Operations, kicked us off with talking about the ongoing stage of the third-party risk management lifecycle and reviewing your vendor SOC reports in cybersecurity. After Lisa, Hershey Long, VendMinder's Senior Information Security Specialist, discuss vendor business continuity management and the processes associated in ensuring vendors have tested those plans. After that, VendMinder's CFO, Raman Zachariah, discussed vendor financial health and what to watch for there. Today, in our final 2 sessions, we're moving on through the third-party risk management lifecycle and focusing on the offboarding stage. Before we get started, I'd like to mention that in the related content widget, you'll see a link to a copy of today's slide deck, a link to our website, a link to our samples library, a link to our library filled with hundreds of educational resources, and links to several resources we've selected to draw your immediate attention to. For the next hour, VendMinder's Greg Cameron, head of third-party risk advisory, will talk about vendor offboarding, focusing on termination and exit plan execution, and then the third-party risk management closure. After that, Hillary Dewhurst will join us again to wrap up this 3-day bootcamp with a governance discussion, including reporting and preparing for exams. With all that being said, I'd like to hand it over to Greg. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Jessie. Well, welcome everyone. Here's our agenda for the first part of the day. First up, an overview of the offboarding stage of third-party risk management. We're looking at an overall view here and what are the third-party risk management lifecycle activities involved. We'll start to drill down deeper, all about exit strategies. We'll talk about what they are, when they should be developed and implemented, and how can they be developed and implemented and tested. We'll talk about key termination activities to consider, and there's some real-life risks and potential challenges here. And lastly, we'll talk about best practices. We'll summarize today's session and reiterate the key points. So let's look at offboarding against the third-party risk management lifecycle. So first and foremost is termination, and this is what most people think about when we talk about offboarding a vendor. This is the aspect that's more on the legal, contractual side. This is going to be fairly standard and consistent in how it's implemented for your business. Next up is the exit plan execution, and this is going to vary by the product or service. This is really more operational based, implemented by the business. And third is third-party risk management closure. So here we're talking about documentation that should be used for future reference, whether it's for audit or future examinations. All right, so let's start to drill into the process of offboarding a vendor. We've said it before, it's worth repeating. No one wants to go into a relationship planning for its demise. But when it comes to your own business and protecting your operations, it's really the best practice. Here are some things in the forthcoming slides that we'll drill even further into. But at a high level, we have to start early. We shouldn't wait to terminate only to find out that our procedures aren't up to snuff and we don't know who to engage on the legal side. We want to validate and test exit strategy in advance. You have to understand what your options are there, what's been developed, and really ensure that whatever you're going to implement is ready and fit for purpose. Following that is the termination of the relationship, and we want to make sure we get the right stakeholders there to make the right decision. And we'll go into further detail there. Then there's the final review, and this is really worth building into your offboarding process. Really an internal assessment there to reflect what's working, what's not, what could have been done better. Well, as was discussed on day one of the boot camp, you establish an exit strategy, especially for critical and high-risk vendors early on when you're selecting and signing contracts. This should be in place well in advance of any formal decision to move away from a vendor. And you should be aware of the best alternate vendor. In case something happens, you have the next best vendor in line and waiting. And the best time to vet any replacement vendor is definitely during the selection process, understanding what your options are there and who's willing and able to be an alternate. Once you have that second place vendor in tow, it's best practice to keep their information. You might even have an informal contract or relationship kind of started at that point, but keep them on file, obviously, if you need to move forward with them in the future. Well, let's just take a moment to actually define an exit strategy. Think for a moment about what would happen if your vendor couldn't provide the service or the product that your organization has paid for. So an exit strategy is considering this in advance and understanding what your options are. It's not necessarily a plan with step-by-step procedures, but it certainly should cover the overall approach or combinations of approaches, which is what we'll talk about momentarily. Should cover who's involved in a sense of how long it will take to implement and how long you can utilize it, or a sense of sustainability of this exit strategy. As mentioned, critical and high-risk vendors are the priority here to have an exit strategy to ensure your organization can remain in operation if and when there's a disruption. So here's some strategies to consider in advance. There's 4 common exit strategies that we talk about. The first being the replacement of the vendor, and some organizations call this an alternate provider. This is typically a full replacement, so it's like for like in terms of the product or service the vendor's delivering. The second would be bringing the activity in-house, and some organizations call this absorption, absorbing the activity back in-house. And this could be partially or fully in terms of what you're absorbing. The third being discontinuing the activity or removing that dependency, no longer needing that product or service. And then certainly the fourth option is to consider some combinations. There might be a situation where you can absorb part of the activity and maybe replace part of the activity. So definitely think about combinations of these 3 methods as well. Well, we've talked about what an exit strategy is, and we've listed some options to consider there. Here are some great steps to refer to as you're developing it for use in the future. First, discuss the strategy across a broad array of your business stakeholders, the internal customers, IT, the other businesses that have a hand in executing the strategy. Maybe it's the folks that are absorbing the work. Bring them in. Make sure you get a collaborative approach here. Think about timelines. How do you minimize risk, and how do you ensure that you're understanding when the triggers to use this strategy are? How quickly do you need to use it? Consider all the alternatives here. In other words, don't rule out any one particular strategy, but also think about how quickly or slowly it's appropriate to roll it out and to actually execute the strategy. Finally, review it and test it. It's only a plan that's on paper unless you test it. We'll have more detail about that in following slides. So who's involved in exit strategies? Well, stakeholders for both the planning and the eventual execution can be identified through a number of questions on these two slides. You should already be thinking about your third-party risk management team, legal, maybe compliance. There could be subject matter experts involved, like your business continuity or cyber team, possibly accounting, accounts payable. These are obvious choices, but definitely go through these questions to develop an inventory of your stakeholders. So first and foremost, do we need to notify or seek approval from board or senior leadership to terminate the vendor? There might be critical vendors that there's extra steps involved here to actually terminate. Who will verbally notify the vendor of termination? That could be legal, or it could be the business that utilizing the service, as they have the closest relationship and contact with them. And who would draft and send written notice? This is the more formal and expected step for termination, and often outlined within contracts. Which termination activities are your responsibility as the customer versus the vendor themselves? And who's going to manage and ensure the vendor is doing what is expected of them contractually in terms of returning equipment and disconnecting to systems and infrastructure? So also think about invoices. Will accounts payable or another team have to run a report and understand what's outstanding there? Do you need to perform any risk assessments before, during, or after offboarding the vendor? Who's responsible for updating the vendor database and archiving the vendor records after offboarding? Who's going to manage issues? What if there are delays in terms of the vendor's responsibility, for example, returning equipment or disconnecting systems? Ensure an owner is assigned to escalate and support that particular issue. Well, our final slide on exit strategies today is about validating and testing the exit strategy. You have to think about, is this the right strategy that we've selected, and are we prepared to execute it? Have we turned it into a plan? Do we have procedures, tasks? Do we have stakeholders that understand their role in this? Here are some considerations when you're testing. First and foremost, think about when you're testing. Is it during normal business hours or on the weekend? That really impacts what you're testing and whether or not you have true visibility to the success of the particular strategy. And think about who will test. Is the alternate vendor involved? Maybe another business unit, the folks that are absorbing work potentially. Think about who's involved and make sure that you get that identified and clearly scoped out. And last, think about objectives and priorities. Is this a full absorption internally, or are you doing partial? Are you doing a full transition to an alternate or partial? What's the primary or the critical part of the product or service that you're really honing in on in terms of the exit strategy? Strategy specific, you might think about bringing the activity in-house. You could think about sustainability. How long can you do that before there's an impact? So who, when, and objectives should really be clearly defined to have a strong test of the exit strategy.
And this brings us to the first poll question of the day. You should see the poll question now in the slides area. If you have any issues, please feel free to send us a message using the Ask Question widget, and we will be happy to assist. Please remember, if you wish to receive the CPE credit for today's session, You must answer all poll questions and be in attendance for the entire live session. This first question is, do you currently have a formal offboarding process for vendor products and services? Yes, no, somewhat, or not sure. And Greg, it looks like we have some time to answer one of the questions that has come in so far from the audience. And that question is, should all of our vendors go through the same steps to offboard?
Thanks, Jesse. Well, largely that's a yes with respect to best practices that we're talking about today. A number of these steps will be consistent regardless of the vendor, product, or service. So, for example, just calling out a few here, starting that process before the contract and before you're actually using the product or service. That's where some of these steps actually really have to start to be developed. Having defined roles and understanding what the exit strategy and plan is, and we'll talk more about that. Knowing the risks with respect to data and how the business is currently using the service, and how they might be impacted, what their dependency levels are. These are all really standard, consistent. Let's see, things like contract closure and the termination of the legal documentation, maybe how other teams are pulled in, like accounts payable, and what their role is to ensure everything's closed and tied up. And then the final reporting, storage of related materials and documents. So there's certainly a large aspect that's consistent. And I would definitely recommend that that be developed like that. But there's a caveat to this question because there's some nuances that sort of vary depending on the type of product or service. So for example, a vendor that has access to personally identifiable information, or PII, that's going to start to bring in some unique steps around data destruction and return of equipment, and that's very different than a vendor that's more staff-oriented service. And you could think of consultants there. They may not be required to do those unique steps, not having access to certain data. So there's definitely some nuances to think about depending on the service type, but absolutely I would go with a yes, largely for this question. You should develop the processes consistently. So there's the steps to follow and to ensure that you're avoiding risks to your business.
Thanks everyone for answering that poll question. Here are those results. By the way, you may have noticed reactions such as a thumbs up or heart coming across the screen. If you find this feature distracting, you can turn it off by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right-hand corner of the Slides widget, which will expand the slides to full screen and no longer show the reactions. Before we move on, as a reminder, in the Related Content widget, you'll find our Offboarding a Vendor Toolkit. This toolkit includes an ebook, infographic, and checklist to assist in offboarding a vendor. Back to you, Greg.
So now we're going to start to drill into terminating a vendor. And here are some tips for how to initiate that. It's really all about asking the right questions and getting the right stakeholders to make the right decision for your organization. So the forthcoming slides will go into a little bit more detail about validating pros and cons, looking at champion versus challenger, evaluating your continuing service requirements, reviewing data security and privacy, and revisiting deconversion costs. Well, validating the pros and cons is the best practice to implement your termination approach, and it's something to be done while you're still under contract with the vendor, regardless of what the driver is and why you're reconsidering the vendor relationship, whether that's delivery-based, service level-based, maybe it's your own needs that have changed, your dependency for that product or service might have declined. These are definitely considerations to build into your decision-making here. So can you validate your judgment? Have you done everything you can to fix the relationship? Have you contacted the vendor? Are they trying to improve performance or resiliency and availability? What do those conversations look like? Do you have evidence the termination is necessary? That might be performance-based over a trend of a few months where it's declined and you've escalated issues to the vendor multiple times. Think about contract terms and what needs to be implemented there on your side as well as the vendor side. Have you documented your offboarding plan? Are you ready to actually pull the trigger? Has it been tested? Do you feel confident that there's risk mitigation there because you've considered an appropriate exit strategy and tested it? And do you understand financial implications? This might be in the form of early termination with a particular vendor, and that might be outlined in your existing contract. Well, another tip for offboarding is champion versus challenger. And this is comparing vendors and having them compete on a level playing field. You want to determine the best quality and service for the same expense that you're already paying. It's essentially a mini vendor selection process, and you could do this every time the vendor contract is up for renewal to validate the risk cost benefit ratio here against your current champion against its own challenger. It's really giving you a competitive advantage, and it's okay to let the vendor know that you apply this and that you're looking at their performance against contractual obligations as a way to look and validate any challengers against them. Well, another consideration is your continuing service requirements. Great best practice here is to understand what your requirements are during the transitional period of this vendor. Some things to look at here is your vendor's obligation during that period in terms of performance and service level agreement. And this might vary and be different from what is expected through the business as usual product service delivery to date. There might be more frequent delivery through the transitional period. So definitely look at those requirements. Next up, defining roles from your vendor during transition. Your primary stakeholders to date might completely be out the window and not who you're working with through transition. So definitely look at the stakeholders and roles during this transition period. Looking at parallel services as well, and maybe this primary vendor is going to support you through the transition period as an alternate and can really ease your transition. And look at additional assurances surrounding the confidentiality, integrity, availability of your data. This should be outlined in the contract, but certainly if there are unique requirements through the transitional period, this is certainly something to look at. So next up is the ever-important data security and privacy. Certainly best practices here as you're terminating. Maintaining the data security is so critical, and especially during transition from one vendor to the next. You need to know what's happening to your data and privacy information during this period. It should be all aligned in your vendor contract as well as your exit strategy. Really, regardless of the exit strategy that you're planning to implement. But these considerations are for any vendor that has access to your data or your customers' data. So several precautions here you want to take in mind. First and foremost, secure transfer of all of your organizational and customer data, as well as any other digital assets the vendor may have had in their possession. So that could be physical or electronic assets. Define a mutually acceptable method of data destruction, and that should be monitored. Make sure that you have access and visibility to that destruction. An assurance that the vendor has destroyed and removed all sensitive information from their systems. They haven't shared your organization's sensitive information, either intentionally or unintentionally. So this should be confirmed, and you should be provided evidence, both with your vendor and potentially their third parties, your fourth parties. Well, another practical element to offboarding would be looking at deconversion costs. You should have had visibility to this through your contract period. You would have known all of the costs and risks and benefits. Under the cost bucket, we're not just talking about the cost of the product and service, but certainly the costs of termination. So consider the following. Is there going to be any additional fees for an early termination? Is the termination for cause, where it's justified contractually? This is also known as termination for default. What are the specific costs of the deconversion from your current vendor, maybe to an alternate vendor, or for additional staff that might be hired if you're absorbing some of the work in-house? What will the new vendor charge for you as a new customer? And are there any additional fees, transition costs, or base service fees? And can you expect return of any prepaid fees for services not delivered?
Our second poll question of the day is, does your organization currently develop exit strategies for vendor products and services? Yes, no, somewhat, or not sure. Greg, I have another question here that I think we can go ahead and answer. And that question is, we don't always have an alternate vendor or the ability to bring vendor activities in-house. Is that okay?
So this really depends on multiple factors. The first thing is we know that in addition to these two strategies, there's the idea of suspending the use or the reliance. And this could be short-term while the vendor is recovering from a disruption, or permanent, where you're no longer going to use the product or service. The predominant factors of whether any of these is okay is criticality and risk. You have to have a good handle on that to identify whether or not this is okay. So for critical vendors and high-risk vendors, you're going to want to ensure there's a viable exit strategy in place. The strongest being the ones that are mentioned in the question, alternate vendors and absorbing activities in-house. Because you have to think about unplanned terminations and exits. For example, if the vendor is going out of business and shuttering, and thinking about, well, how does that then impact your business, your own internal customers that are using the service? They might be at risk if there's no ability to bring the activities in-house or transition. So for that particular scenario, critical or high risk, it may not be okay, and you may need to pursue other strategies, or maybe remove the dependency altogether in your business. Certainly for low risk, there is an opportunity to suspend, where you have not as a strong exit strategy in place there. That might be okay, where you have a low dependency level and a longer or less severe business recovery demand. So for that situation, I would say it's okay. So it's a tough question, but hopefully that's some useful considerations to allow you to review these situations. Back to you, Jesse.
Okay, here are those results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I'd like to direct your attention to our How to Manage Issues with Vendors infographic in the related content widget. This infographic discusses what vendor issues are, why they are important, and the process of vendor issue management. We encourage you to check it out. I'll hand it back to you, Greg.
All right, well, it's time to terminate the relationship. We've made the decision. We've done all the prep work. The right stakeholders have gotten together. It's time for the difficult task of notifying your vendor. It can be challenging. Clear communication can really ensure that the process flows smoothly for both parties. Think about formal notification. Should be thinking about recovering assets and taking the inventory of what that looks like. Should be considering issues that you might run into as you terminate and who to escalate to. You should be thinking about finalizing payments and closing out that part of the contract and accounts payable. And updating any systems to reflect if it's a critical vendor, the fact that the relationship is closed and terminated and no longer requires things like risk assessment and further monitoring past a certain date. So here are some tips to implement termination, some ideas, further detail around concepts that were mentioned earlier. Some things to do are validating judgment. This is across all of your stakeholders. Are you sure you need to terminate the relationship? Choosing to terminate is a very major decision. There's operational risk, there's financial risk. So to avoid the potential of risk, operational impacts, financial, costly mistakes, make sure you slow down, think it out, get the right stakeholders involved to make the decision and actually validate judgment there. And consider if you've done everything you can to fix the relationship. I mentioned before, they might be working on improving their service levels that might have been trending in the wrong direction. But suppose the issue goes to litigation and your organization can't prove that those efforts were made. In that case, you could be on the losing side of a legal judgment. So certainly consider if everything has been done and if you have the right evidence towards that. Some additional tips for implementing termination would be gathering the evidence, proving that the service level agreements weren't met or there's a decline, evidence against your key performance indicators. You might have documented discussions regarding vendor performance. Maybe there's some meeting minutes or communications to the vendor around that topic. Evidence around data breach or customer complaints or other vendor failures or disruptions or lack of availability. Review contract terms. Carefully review to ensure that you're within your rights to terminate in terms of timing and the justification for the reason. Make sure you're clear on those on the termination notice timing and the methodology of that communication. We talked about it before, but understand financial implications. So there is a cost to exiting the relationship, from fees to training new vendors, decline in revenue during a transition. There's a few factors here to weigh in as part of the decision. So we want to recommend a final review as a final step post-termination. So as you're concluding your termination and your final steps of the exit plan, it's a good practice to take time to reflect on the situation you're in and identify any opportunities of improvement that you could utilize in the future. That might be on the termination side with your legal department. That might be in how you've built up and validated exit strategies. Or there might be some more logistical, tactical software and reporting aspects that need to be improved. Take an inventory. Get a sense of what's working and what's not. Could your organization have done anything differently? for a better outcome, less cost, less impact, less concern or headaches that you've felt during this period of transition and termination. What red flags might have popped up, things that were missed? Maybe there are steps and procedures that were missed that you want to revisit. How'd you get yourself into that situation where there were key red flags that have popped up? Were the instructions or requirements clear enough for the vendor? Was there anything missing in the contract? Were you clear about your continuing requirements? Was that shared? Did the vendor receive them successfully and confirm and validate what you're asking for? So make sure to document your findings, share them with your team, use this as an opportunity to improve the next exit, termination, and overall offboarding process. Well, I want to conclude this section with a few slides that tie together some best practices for offboarding and reiterate some key best practices and themes from earlier. So having that hard discussion before you notify your vendor in writing that they're being terminated, make sure to discuss the issue verbally, clearly spell out your arguments, and provide the validated evidence. And this step will help your vendor understand your perspective and rationale for the termination. So they'll be less likely to protest the termination, support the process, and understand and agree to your continuing requirements. Provide the right notification. Make sure you formally notify your vendor. And formal notification means that it's in writing and it's in compliance with what's in your contract with the particular vendor. Maintain the communication throughout the entire process. It doesn't always feel good. The stakeholders that you're working with through the transition period might be different than the stakeholders and the vendor support team that you've been working with to date. But solid level of communication can make the process more agreeable for both parties. Bring as many folks into the conversation as possible, and keep it professional. Emotions might run high on both sides through termination. It's essential to treat the vendor with respect. You can expect that back as a professional courtesy. Regardless of how they've performed, your organization should set the tone and protect its own reputation with how you're treating your vendor through the termination process. So, small world, keep it professional and courteous. And manage your exit plan. Make sure this is done carefully. Ensure you have a project plan, maybe a project manager, maybe that's the vendor owner or a different team. It could be a complex process to offboard, so make sure that there's appropriate resources dedicated to this task of managing the exit. Monitor access to equipment or data. If the vendor has access to your organization's equipment or data, ensure that they follow the proper procedures to return or destroy it. Make sure that any user credentials of the vendor have been deactivated or access to facilities have been revoked. Review outstanding payments. Make sure that the vendor is paid in full. Take care of that. Check that off before offboarding process is complete. And manage issues. If there are delays in terms of returning that equipment or confirming disconnection of systems, document that as part of your overall risk management program. Make sure it's escalated. Make sure that there's visibility to those issues and assure an owner is assigned to it. Might have to get legal representatives or senior management involved to support you on issues identified. For this session, we'll be talking about third-party risk management closure. The last phase and element of the offboarding aspect to the third-party risk management lifecycle We talked about termination, we talked about exit strategies. Let's talk about the closure best practices and what's involved there to consider. Well, our agenda for this section will be what happens after you complete the exit plan. Confirming final termination steps, for example, returning IT assets, capturing issues, and what are issues and what are some of the best practices there. And updating metrics and reporting. What's the appropriate record keeping best practices to employ? Well, it's always great to tie it back to our life cycle visual. You can see for the offboarding phase as we conclude the relationship, and there's been the termination aspect with legal and contract. There's been the exit plan execution with the business and the internal customers. There's this aspect of closure, and it really more of a governance aspect from your typically driven and maintained by your third-party risk management team and the primary stakeholders involved in the overall governance and accountability for best practices here. So I want to take a moment to define and make sure that we're clear on understanding what an issue is. Traditional definition is an important topic or problem for debate or discussion. From a third-party risk management lens, an issue is any unexpected result or scenario requiring further evaluation or actions to mitigate risk. Obviously, these can be experienced through termination, through your exit strategy and plan implementation. It's important that your team is clear on what an issue is so that you can identify it, identify an owner, and implement some best practices around issues management. So issues management can really be broken down into 3 simple steps. The first being identifying and capturing the issue. We know what an issue is. Now we have to identify when it happens. Again, might be happening through your termination steps, through your exit strategy, implementation steps. Simply recognize the issue. Examples of issues can be security concerns, lack of confirmation of the fact that data has been destructed, or lack of validation that infrastructure with your vendor has been disconnected, or access to physical locations and data centers have been revoked. So there could be security concerns that you'd want to document as an issue. There might be poor vendor communication. You're asking for confirmation, you're not getting it. Or you're escalating the performance and you're not getting a response back to how they're trying to comply to your continuing requirements. That might not be meeting SLAs, whether that's contractual or through the transition period. That's certainly an issue if you're not getting what's expected. There might be the delay in the equipment return, or again, lack of validated data destruction. So identifying the issue first and foremost. And well, the second step will be managing the issue. You should be doing the following. You should be taking a collaborative approach. There are multiple stakeholders that should be involved here. And you should be tracking data points. For example, vendor name. What is the product or service? What's the root cause of the issue? You could take into account severity. There might be lower rated issues or more severe issues. This could be around operational risk or impact to your business. Certainly severity to the issue is a key factor. Date of the issue. When did it happen? Is it an ongoing issue or a one-time issue that's triggered? Give a sense of an overview so all stakeholders involved really have a clear understanding of what's going on and what's expected in terms of managing this issue. How about next follow-up? What's expected for next steps? Who's responsible for it? Does the vendor have an action for next steps? Is it internal for your own group to perform something before you reassemble and talk about the issue? And understanding issue escalation. There should be a mechanism to ensure that it can go somewhere. If you're not getting the resolution that's expected, escalate. That might be legal. Certainly from a contract perspective, that's a great way to escalate. Or it might be a risk committee, or for smaller organizations, maybe going right up to the board. And the third and final step here is to track the issue through remediation. Discuss the concerns with the vendor. Keep your team informed of the progress. It's recommended to keep a conversation log, maybe meeting minutes. Let everyone know, be very transparent about how the issue's been handled to date, who's doing what, and where are you in terms of the expected action plan. Escalate and terminate the vendor as needed, and report on the issue as it's being closed and confirmed as no longer an issue. Well, here's some final steps to consider within your third-party risk management closure. Recovering assets, so important. We've talked about it multiple times that it's worth repeating here, that retrieving and ensuring the destruction of your data, your customer's data, has been validated and confirmed. Confirm the return of any of your organization's equipment or any other assets, revoking access and credentials to physical facilities, data centers, equipment closets, or access to systems remotely or physically. Recovering assets is so important. This is certainly something that could slip through the cracks. Certainly initiated through your termination, through your contract termination clauses, and part of your exit strategy, but it's third-party risk management closure that really ensures that you can conclude this activity and it's been confirmed. Finally, finalizing payments as well. This might have been triggered. This is where you should confirm that it's been concluded, the payments have gone through, and there's no further actions involved to that end. Well, updating metrics and reporting is certainly a key aspect to the closure. First and foremost, updating vendor database. This might just be normal active inventory. This is making sure that it's reflected, that it's no longer being reassessed. There's no further due diligence involved, no longer monitoring or tracking for risk indicators or performance is required. We want to make sure that we're flipping the switch and deactivating those from a database or systems perspective, whatever your third-party risk management tool might be. There's also the critical inventory. You should think about if the product or service is from a critical vendor, what the implications are there, and if there's no longer that vendor relationship, updating that critical vendor list and making sure that that's shared with the appropriate stakeholders. Might be the board, might be third-party risk management risk committee or otherwise. This could be described in your policy and should be referred to. But such an important part of offboarding and third-party risk management closure. So look at metrics, look at reporting, check the box, make sure you're really comprehensive in your closure and including this as part of the steps.
Our third poll question of the day is, do you feel your offboarding process can be improved based on today's bootcamp session? Yes, no, somewhat, or not sure. And Greg, I do have another question here from the audience that we can answer. And that question is, we have never actually tested an exit plan. Where should we start?
Sure. Well, it's a great question. I would definitely recommend starting as soon as possible. Testing is your validation that your strategy is viable and it's the right decision for your business. So don't think of testing as pass-fail, but as a review as to what's working and what's not. I would say start at the top down, look at your critical vendors or high-risk vendors, and look at the exit strategies and planning information there. So from a risk perspective, starting top down definitely makes a lot of sense in terms of validation of the exit plans that you've developed. You could also understand that there's different ways of testing. It doesn't have to be a formal full-scale test. That could be overwhelming as an initial start, or even could impact, your business or your customers if it's a full-scale, for example, transition test. So think about other types of tests, like a walkthrough, looking at the procedures. Is everything comprehensive and documented? Thinking about a tabletop, bringing in your stakeholders. Does everyone know their role? And allow them to scrutinize the steps and look for opportunities of improvement. As you mature, yes, absolutely, full scale is the best type of test to validate your strategy. So that's something that you can mature and aspire to. That puts you in the best position to know that the exit plan is ready to go. I guess the last thing I'll mention if you're testing for the first time is objectives. You're going to want to validate that it's the right strategy. You're going to want to confirm roles and responsibilities. Look at sustainability. How long can you actually use this exit strategy? Because that might identify that you want to use multiple strategies in combination. And just evaluate what's documented. Is there any other development needed? Is it comprehensive? Do you need to do more testing in the future because of a poor result? So those are some key objectives to build into your test methodology as well. Thanks, Jesse.
Here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question, as it is interesting to see what everyone says. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Greg.
Well, for our final slide for this particular section, I just want to take a moment to reiterate some best practices for third-party risk management closure. And we want to ensure all stakeholders are aware of their role. That's both internal and external. We want to proactively manage issues. Make sure you're doing this consistently. We talked about capturing issues, managing issues, and following them to remediation and closure. Confirm data-related steps are completed. We're talking about destruction of data, returning physical access, revoking access to software and physical locations. Validate termination has not impacted internal customers. This is great to follow up with the business stakeholders that have implemented an exit strategy. Are they using an alternate successfully? Have they absorbed successfully? Or is there a combination of exit strategies that they've employed that should be followed up with? And review lessons learned. As you conclude your termination, we talked about this. Take time to reflect. Look for improvement opportunities that you could leverage in the future. And make sure you document your findings in terms of issues and for lessons learned. Share them with your team. Make sure that you're improving the process. Obviously across termination and exit, as we've talked about, but even just for third-party risk management closure. More administrative, certainly, for reporting and metrics, but there still could be lessons learned, some findings. Bring all your stakeholders in, make sure you're talking about lessons learned.
Great. Thanks so much, Greg, for the informative session. Before we move on to our next session, where Hillary will discuss third-party risk management governance with a focus on reporting, we're going to take a quick 5-minute break. Please meet us back right here in 5 minutes. You do not need to close out and log back in. Just simply leave everything as is. Welcome back, everyone. Now we are going to move into our next session, governance reporting. You heard from Hillary Dewhurst on the first day of boot camp, and we'll hear more from her now. Hillary, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jesse. All right, so this is the very last boot camp session. Thank you so much for staying with us. So for this last session, we have two segments. The first of which I'm going to talk about reporting. It's such an important part of third-party risk management. And we'll be talking about what you need to be doing, who should be involved, and how reporting is done. And then we'll discuss how reporting can help you with vendor performance. In the second half of the session, I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about governance and exam and audit prep for your third-party program. Now, what I'm going to cover there can be applied to any audit or exam, but the specific references to the processes and documents are all going to be geared towards third-party risk management. So let's jump into reporting. Just a reminder, here's the life cycle that we've been covering over the last few days, and it might help to use this as a guideline. If you look carefully, you'll see that governance is really the foundation of the life cycle, and those elements of governance include oversight and accountability, documentation and reporting, and independent review. So we're going to talk today about reporting and independent review, or as we like to call them, audits and exams. Reporting and independent review are integral to the oversight and accountability. So that's why we're going to discuss both during this last session. For many industries, reporting is a regulatory requirement because the board and senior leadership are ultimately accountable for the organization's third-party risk management program. And even in non-regulated organizations, your senior leadership still needs all that information so that they can determine the relative health and stability of that program and understand the amount of risk in the portfolio. We also use reporting to confirm whether or not our organization is compliant, if our vendors are compliant, and to make decisions regarding the third-party risk management program. So when we talk about the reporting that we're providing to senior leadership on the board, that reporting that helps them confirm that the program is healthy and stable, there are several metrics that we should look at. But I want to take a look at some specific ones and really ask you to consider including them in that board and senior level reporting. The first one is vendor inventory. And this is really about the number of vendors that we have by risk level or rating. So we need to identify all the critical vendors, and we need to point out if the vendor population has changed at all. Has it gotten larger? Has it gotten smaller? Is it remaining stable? We also want to identify how many critical vendors we have versus maybe the same time last year. And we want to use this number to determine if we have a good number of vendor to employee ratio. So do we have enough people to manage this amount of vendors? The second item would be risk assessments, and that's all the data that is collected from due diligence and periodic risk assessments. And we should really be able to understand at any given time how many vendors require these assessments, and if those assessments are on time, are they completed, or are they at risk, are they past due even? We want to document how many vendors weren't approved during due diligence as well, because that can be a fantastic measure of the process actually working. We want to have a metric around program compliance. So how are we reporting if our business lines are following all the required processes and procedures for third-party risk management? So, do certain lines of business have late or missing deliverables? Are we making a lot of process exceptions? And if we have been, why? And the vendor risk assessments and performance monitoring taking place on time and meeting all the requirements. So program compliance is a really good metric as well. So there's other metrics to consider. A really important metric is about your vendor issues. So we want to make sure that we have good visibility into not just the specific vendor risk issues, but also the trends around the amount and types of issues we're seeing. We want to make sure that we're really capturing if any of our critical or high-risk vendors have had any business interrupting events, such as a data breach or a business continuity event. We also want to look at is anybody out there getting negative news? Was a big news story broke that affects one of our vendors? That would be something to include in the reporting. Just keep in mind that whatever the issue is, that material issues must always be reported and monitored. So that brings us to another category, which are new and emerging risks. So as you all know, risk is not a static environment. It's constantly changing. And a good example would be the cyber criminals that are keeping us all on our toes and awake at night because they're so creative and persistent about attacking our organizations and their data. You know, some of these issues didn't exist 10, 15 years ago, and some of the issues we're looking at today, or those newer emerging risks, didn't exist 5 months ago. So we want to make sure that we're calling out any new or emerging risks, and those can be within the industry, our organization, or with a specific vendor. We also want to make sure we're capturing this because it's highly likely that we are going to need to respond to those risks, and that response is going to need probably action from various stakeholders and support from senior leadership. The next thing to consider are any regulatory changes. So have there been any proposed updates? Have we seen any changes or amendments or additions to current guidance? We want to make sure that we can not only call out what those changes are, but we want to be able to identify how they're going to impact our program and our processes. You know, are we going to have to update the way we do something? Or are we going to need another set of controls? That is why regulatory considerations are an important part of reporting. Now, the last thing you're going to need is a reporting timeline that really shows the stakeholders the cadence of the report that you're going to deliver, so what they should be expecting when, and who will be receiving, which specific report. This is really important. You don't want people to come ask you for data. You want them to get used to receiving it so they know to review it. And this can be both, you know, in the concept of, hey, we're going to deliver this during our formal committee meeting, but also the first Monday of the month, you have a report in your email inbox. Okay, so what should be reporting and to whom? We've discussed the what, but let's go on to the whom. In general principles, you want to make sure that your reporting always does at least one of two things. The first is to inform your stakeholders, and the other is to drive action. And good reporting is often going to do a combination of both. So when it comes to informing your stakeholders, you have to consider which data points are going to be most beneficial, right? Many of the reports you create are going to be generated to just purely inform your stakeholders of the overall program, some of those metrics we mentioned. But let's take a look at 3 common stakeholder groups and what specifically they're expecting regarding reporting. So the first one is risk committees. So most organizations, you know, will have some sort of risk committee. And this risk committee generally has the collective role of identifying and mitigating risks before they become material issues. Third-party risk management reporting should always be able to provide a regular view of program compliance, a focus on new and emerging risks, vendor issues, and items requiring action. Because once an issue is identified, a treatment plan needs to be established. And it's always best to present issues needing action to your committee first. That way, you've got the right people in the room to solve the problem, and they become engaged before that issue shows up on a senior leadership or board report. So speaking of senior leadership, this is a major stakeholder group that we're going to provide reporting to on a regular basis. Now keep in mind, your senior leadership, including your C-level executives, they're the ones who are accountable for making sure that the third-party risk management program is operating as it should. So the reporting that we give them should help them confirm that it is, or help them identify the areas where it is not. We want to make sure that the senior leadership report include items that need their influence, right? So we want to put those right up front. These are the issues where we need support. And we also want to include our standard set of metrics. So that would be your vendor portfolio, your program compliance, significant vendor issues, any new or emerging risks, etc. Just make sure that when you have issues that show up at that level, they always have an associated mitigation plan and a status on that plan. There's nothing is worse than having an executive ask you, so what's up with that? And you don't have an answer. So just make sure that's always included in that reporting. Now, lastly, we have our board of directors, and they're basically responsible for oversight, right? They need to make sure that everything's working as it should and hold senior leadership accountable if it is not. The data that we give to the board should really help them assess if everything is working properly. Is it effective? Is it within the rules? Reporting to the board really should always include a high-level view of the program size, risk exposure, compliance, and material risk issues. We'll jump into the details just a little bit more. Now with this, I think we have our first poll. Jesse?
We are to the first poll question of session 6. This poll question is, does your organization prepare an annual third-party risk management report for the board of directors? Yes, no, we don't have a board of directors, or you're not sure? Hillary, while we wait for the results to tabulate on this one, let's answer a question from the audience.
Okay.
And that question is, our vendor risk software has automatic reporting available. Do we have to actually distribute that reporting, or is it okay to inform the stakeholders that it is there?
This is an interesting question, mostly because a lot of the regulations around reporting to the board are going to want you to demonstrate that you gave that reporting to the board. So for board level, senior management level, even your risk committees, I wouldn't recommend just sending them a note saying, hey, it's there. I would actually go ahead and distribute that through an email or some other managed outlet so that you can track that you sent it and, you know, make sure that it got there, et cetera. When it comes to your regular stakeholders, if you've set up regular reporting that they can go in and get on their own, that's fine. But if you're updating it at a certain point, maybe monthly, it's always a good idea to send out a note saying the monthly reporting's available now. But for those, you know, big reports, senior leadership, the board, risk committee meetings, don't depend on someone going into your system to pull the reporting. Make sure you distribute it appropriately.
Thanks, everyone. Here are those results. As a reminder, in the related content widget, you'll find how to report vendor risk management activity to the board toolkit. This toolkit is a great resource for reporting to the board. An infographic, a Word template, and a PowerPoint template. We encourage you to take a look. Back to you, Hillary.
All right, so this is a little bit more of a consolidated view on what to report to whom and when. So in most cases, we're going to have some monthly reporting, quarterly reporting, and annual reporting. And we want to make sure that we're reporting the right information at the right time. So let's look at our monthly case. So that might be for your direct line management or for a vendor risk committee or even the lines of business. And due to the frequency of this report, we really should focus on what the stakeholders need to know or do now. This reporting should also include what's coming up for the next 30 days regarding deliverables, communications, audits, etc. And you may want to provide a status report of issue remediation as well. So this is really that need to know and drive action that's necessary now. When we get into our quarterly reports, this might be for a broader risk committee or a similar governing body. We want to use that reporting not only to provide a picture of the program in general, but to drive into specific issues that need action or intervention. So this reporting also provides the foundation for short-term planning. So, is there going to be a big regulatory change that we're going to have to address? Do we need additional people or resources to make the program work better? Are there any, big deal breakers out there with our critical or high-risk vendors? So again, this quarterly cadence really gives you the opportunity for information, action, and planning. Now, annually, the board should be reviewing the health of the third-party risk program at least once a year. And this report that we're giving them should be really quite comprehensive. Remember that board or senior leadership needs enough information to ensure the program is on track. So we need to show them how we stack up against our defined program metrics and if we have strong internal compliance. We also need to highlight the results of any audit or exam and or regulatory changes. It's also a really good time for the TPRM program reporting to include your successes or challenges in the plan or your roadmap for the next 1 to 2 years. As a recommendation, if you can influence the timing of this particular report, it really should be a companion presentation to the board as part of the annual policy review or update. Now, we did that overview of who should be getting what reporting when and for what reason. So let's just talk about some best practices here. There's just a few things to remember with reporting, and it's not just third-party risk management reporting, it's any reporting you're giving to anyone. But the key components of good reporting is that it's accurate, easily digestible, timely, and accessible. So let's dive into that just a little bit. First of all, accurate, we don't need a lot of explanations on that. It means that we've checked and rechecked our work, that we make sure that we're reporting on the correct data elements and that all the equations, et cetera, are correct. The next thing is easily digestible. So when you're giving a report, especially to senior leadership, the board, a risk committee, chances are they're not going to have a lot of extra time or energy to review reports that are 50 pages long. We want to try and give them the most condensed version of that information. We want to make it really clear what we're reporting on the page. Should be very, very clear to someone who does not understand third-party risk management what specifically you're reporting on. So make sure that it's easily digestible. We don't need a big, secret decoder ring to read our report. The next thing is that it's timely, and oh my gosh, this one is another one that seems obvious, but nobody will be happy if you raise attention to an issue that you've known about for 6 months. Accuracy and timeliness are so key to getting our senior leadership and other stakeholders to commit to action. So please make sure your data is timely. And then finally, it's accessible. So accessible means that the reporting is easily gathered. It could be that you are currently, downloading several spreadsheets and creating a master spreadsheet, putting in all these formulas and calculations and pivot tables. That is not the most accessible reporting. We want to make sure that in the event you win the lottery or someone else who does the reporting, that it's easy to recreate, that we don't need a 27-step process to get our reporting. So it should be kept simple and accessible. The next thing is really about getting that vendor risk management reporting cadence together. We want to make sure that folks are not only expecting the information, but they're absorbing it. And the best way to do that is to let them know when they're going to get it and follow up, maybe saying, hey, we sent out this reporting on Monday. If anybody has any questions, let us know. But make sure you have a calendar so that they know first Monday of the month they get a report, or the first week of the second quarter they get a report. Whatever it is, publish a calendar. And then finally, use that reporting as a tool to help drive compliance. right? Numbers speak for themselves. They're not full of opinion. So if you need action, support your case with data and reporting. Now, I think we are going to move to our next section now, which for me is always a favorite. So we're going to be talking about governance, preparing for those audits and exams. So, all right, so today we'll be talking first about how independent reviews are really the foundation of good governance. And we'll be examining what your vendors and auditors are really looking for, what they expect from you, and what you should be giving them. Now, I know this topic makes a lot of people really anxious, but I'm going to break it down for you to help you prepare for these without a lot of extra worry. So let's get started. Now, once again, here's our life cycle stages that we've been covering in the boot camp, and you're going to look at that foundation of governance, which includes independent reviews, which are audits and exams in the foundation of the life cycle. Now, this is really important to understand that third-party risk audits and exams are a natural and healthy part of our business process, and they really do support everything else we do because they essentially keep us honest and on track. So let's look at that a little bit more. So in general, the audit and exam process overall can really be applied to any audit or exam, regardless of the scope. But when we talk about specific guidelines, processes, or deliverables today, I'm going to be focused on the third-party risk management process. So if you take anything away from the session today, it should be this. The best way for audits and exams to run smoothly now and in the future is to operate with a constant awareness that audits are part of a healthy business process. As such, there is a need to conduct your processes as if they're going to be audited daily. Everything matters, from following the rules in your policy to adhering to your processes, review and approvals, and keeping your documentation current and organized. You want to make sure you have regulatory awareness. Make sure you know what regs apply to you and what you're responsible for. Look them up, study them, and know where you may or may not fall short. To help with this, you definitely want to leverage some of the external resources out there because there's a lot of information on the internet and there's a lot of interpretation on the regulations. You can get it for free, and if nothing else, it can really help you understand some of those more complex requirements. You have to marry your process with an audit trail. So take a look at your processes and procedures and review it with an auditor's eye. Do those processes and procedures produce tangible evidence that you're following them? And by this, I mean the tangible evidence that a step in your process is being performed. So some examples of that might be notifications from another team or ticketing system that triggers your process to start, questionnaires or evidence that any deviation from your standards has been approved by leadership. There could be data files exported from your vendor database, etc. It could be the process to keep your vendor inventory current. Make sure you have a good audit trail. And speaking of your vendor database or inventory, make sure you're keeping up with it because that could be one of the most cumbersome parts of third-party risk management and audit prep. And if you don't have a good system to support it, you're going to be in trouble. Be sure your processes and methodology are repeatable and reportable. So make sure those articles of evidence are practically and consistently incorporated. If you find that you don't have a lot of articles or evidence, it's a good idea to start finding where you can produce them. So what are the natural checkpoints in your process? See if you can add some evidence to them. This might be as simple as making sure to put things in an email after it's been agreed upon over the phone. But just remember, as you're developing deliverables, if they're too complex or labor intensive, they're just not going to get done, or at least they're not going to get done consistently, and you may end up in a lot of audit cleanup when the time comes. And if your process tends to be ad hoc, or there's just a lot of things that are done on a case-by-case basis, going to be really hard to come up with consistent evidence. And so from an audit perspective, there's just not going to be a lot to test. So try to incorporate practical and consistent evidence wherever you can. And finally, understand where you fall short. The goal is that the policy meets the expectations of the regulators and that the process meets the requirement of the policy. It's much better to know what is expected of you and the reasons you have why you're not doing it than it is to be taken by surprise. Now, when preparing for any exam or audit, we need to establish an expectation. You need to know what they're going to need from you, and you should be ready to help them out by being prepared and facilitating a smooth audit. At least that's how you should approach the conversation as you ask for information. You know, people need time to adjust their schedules. Evidence takes time to gather. So get a schedule locked down as early as you can, which allows time for everything you want to discuss. Ask, if you can, for the list of actual controls they're going to be testing and the recommended evidence or deliverables if they're willing to give it to you. You want to know this ahead of time because sometimes the evidence they're specifically asking for doesn't always make sense for the way your organization does things. But if you understand those controls, you might be able to demonstrate how you're implementing them in another way. 9 times out of 10, an auditor should be totally okay with that, so talk to them. Let's get into a little bit more detail about the documents that you'll be providing. And I really want to emphasize this first point. The accessibility and accuracy of your data is going to paint a picture of your overall program. So if it's really difficult for you to provide something that an auditor is asking for, or what you give them is misleading or accurate, then that's going to be a problem. So when your examiner reviews your documentation, missing or misleading evidence will give the impression that your whole program might be weak or faulty. So take special consideration when you have other stakeholders providing evidence for their processes to make sure you understand the documentation they're providing and have them validate what's going out the door. So if anyone else is speaking to your processes, make sure you meet with that person and you review the documents they're providing. Review, update, and sign off on the accuracy of your policy and program documents at least once a year. This is an excellent way to make your audits run smoother. Even if nothing has changed, make sure you sign off on it, and ideally within the document itself. You know, every policy should have a section for approvals with the name and date of the person who approved it. Now, if that approval is a response to an email, then keep that email. If it was a verbal conversation, then recap the conversation with the approver in the email and ask them to respond that your summary is correct and represents the verbal approval. Many of us know that the board should approve the policy, so getting a copy of the meeting minutes detailing that approval is suitable evidence as well. Now, just to reiterate, make sure what you provide aligns with your policy. The auditors are going to have a list of controls that they need to validate, and those controls come from regulatory guidance. But often, and I would argue that a good auditor is going to review your program and policy first to make sure it covers everything it should, and then they're going to use your own policy as a basis for testing. For example, if your program says you keep an inventory of all the vendors, then show me a sample of that inventory. Does the policy say that all high-risk vendors are reviewed once a year? Great. Here are 10 high-risk vendors from your inventory. Show me the evidence that the review has been completed in the last year. Some other requested evidence might be, say, the methodology or justification for your risk ratings, which might come by way of your risk assessment details or evidence that senior leadership is informed of high-risk items. And this is where you might share a sample of your periodic executive reports. Finally, when you're preparing for an audit team to come on site, make sure you know who is going to be involved in providing information to them. Sometimes there's a delegate that collects information from all the other areas and acts as a liaison to the auditors. And other times, this may be select representatives from each process to be available for questioning or make a presentation. Make sure that you understand the larger scope of the audit and that everyone is on the same page. This means being aware of the requirements that they're representing, and again, for any reason they're representing a third-party risk management process, you must determine what the context is and make sure that what they are presenting is accurate and doesn't conflict with your facts. The more organized you are, the better. And if you do decide to have a delegate or a liaison to work with the auditors, be really careful that you don't give the impression that you're using them as a gatekeeper to prevent them from happening on issues. But we'll get into that in a little bit. Also, be prepared to speak to your process weaknesses and problem vendors, because we all have them. It doesn't have to be a secret, and auditors are going to want to see what steps you're taking to improve and manage these issues as they arise. So don't try and hide the bad vendors under the bed. So it can be really difficult to look at your everyday work from the outside in. But when it comes to audits and exams, you have to try. You've got to start by assuming that that auditor examiner knows nothing about your day-to-day operations, because they probably don't. And because of that, you will want to start with the big picture, like who oversees what and how third-party risk management fits into your organization. From there, you could discuss roles and responsibilities more generally, and then how those roles and responsibilities interact with the third-party risk management lifecycle. Some of you might be a little bit like me and get really sidetracked occasionally, but even if you have to rehearse a little bit, make sure you can tell that top-down story very clearly without going on tangents. The next thing is transparency. Keep in mind that a good auditor is going to be able to tell if they're being misled or stonewalled. You know, they're trained and programmed to feel out those invisible walls, and they will attack those walls if they're discovered. But speak up, because it's okay to tell an examiner if something doesn't make sense or necessarily apply to your situation. You know, sometimes people worry that I'm going to ask questions, I'm going to look stupid. But on the contrary, it can really demonstrate that you're confident in your program and you're aware of existing weaknesses. So some helpful hints, and I'm sure you've heard this plenty by now, but you'll know it's good advice when we say exams are meant to be a win-win. All right, so as third-party risk management professionals, we're in a very unique position to see both sides of the story very clearly, because when we do reviews of our vendors, we want to understand what they're doing and what they need to protect our assets, right? So we take that approach that the assessment is not just good for us, but it's good for our vendors, because if they have to improve their processes or security to meet our standards, in the end, it's going to make them better for their existing clients and for their future ones as well. Well, same is true when you have an examiner at your door. When they discover gaps or issues and make recommendations, it's ultimately to make your program better. And the added benefit is that it protects your organization and customers from unnecessary risk. And this is especially true in the case of regulated industries, because left unchecked, these risks have the potential to harm consumers and the economy very seriously. And the regulators are charged with preventing those scenarios from happening. So keeping that win-win outlook has an added benefit, because showing cooperation with your examiners ultimately builds their trust, and that's what you want, okay? If you tell them you do something and are showing them the best evidence you have and are honest about what weaknesses you have, and they feel that you're being cooperative, they're a lot less likely to go looking for that proverbial rabbit hole to jump down. But transparency is key to a smooth sailing audit. A good auditor, again, will be able to sense when something is not right. It's in their programming. They know how to look for these things. So if you presented evidence based on their initial discovery phase, and they turn around and ask for more details, and you stonewall them, well, that is going to raise a red flag, because you know darn well that as a third-party assessor, this might mean that they're painting pretty pictures, but they don't want you to scratch behind the surface and see what's in the back of the closet. So always try your best to be, or at least get the impression that you're being totally transparent. Now, on the other side of that, given that these auditors are programmed to look for issues, it's not uncommon that the process can lead to questions and requests that start to push outside of the scope that was originally agreed upon. We call that scope creep. And you want to be transparent, but you've also taken the time and effort to support all the requests. But if they start to change once they're in the door and the requests are really outside the agreed scope of the audit, it's okay to ask for a pause and discuss the issue with your management or the audit committee. So you've got to speak up if something doesn't feel right, or if you feel like you're being overly interrogated as opposed to being evaluated. And it's also okay to tell an examiner if something doesn't make sense or apply to your situation. Like I said before, reviewing the controls ahead of time, everyone does things differently, and there's no single way to implement an effective control. Some people worry that asking those questions is going to make them look bad, but I really think it's a good thing to ask questions and demonstrate that you're confident in your program. Now, if you've been through the audit or exam process before, the scenario on the slide is going to probably resonate with you. And if you've yet to have that audit or exam experience, chances are very good that you will sooner than later. So when that day comes, it's really good to be mindful that audits and exams are part of a healthy business process. I got to say it over and over. I used to really like the analogy of going to the dentist for your annual checkup, because the dentist is there to identify potential issues before they develop into more serious and usually more expensive or painful problems. So like that dentist who can see the tiny cavity in your tooth before it needs a root canal or worse, audits and exams are meant to help the organization ensure that all is well, that your program is operating as intended and complies with your policy. Okay, so maybe you're not feeling all rosy about an upcoming audit because there are several issues with the TPRM program. Maybe there's been a lot of verbal approvals with no record, or maybe you're really behind on your annual risk review process, or you have a high-risk vendor that's been performing horribly for months. There could be any number of concerns that need remediation or improvement. So listen to me carefully. The worst thing you can do at this point is go on a mad scramble and try and fix everything before the exam starts. For one, it's not possible to fix everything that fast. If it were just that easy, you wouldn't have these problems in the first place. And two, let's remember that dentist analogy. If your dentist asks you if you're flossing your teeth and you say, oh yes, I floss them every day, but reality, it's only once in a while, that dentist is going to know the truth. They just have to look in your mouth. And you are going to walk out of that office with a bunch of dental floss and some pretty stern instructions to floss every day. Examiners and auditors are trained to look for consistency in any process execution and availability of evidence. Furthermore, if they suspect that you've tried to cover up or minimize those problems, that's only going to request more requests, more scrutiny, and a much longer audit duration. So finally, we've got to expect some findings because no program is perfect.
The next poll question is, which types of independent reviews are done for your third-party risk management program? Regulatory exams, internal audits, external audits, a combination of the above, no independent reviews are done, or not sure? Hillary, here's another question for you from the audience.
Okay.
Could you talk about self-identified issues and how to use them during an audit?
Oh, sure. Well, self-identified issues, first of all, are those gaps or weaknesses in your program that you know exist and you know might show up on an audit. And from the minute you get notified that you are getting an audit or an exam, before you supplement any of that other documentation back, it's a good idea to document those issues up front, and don't forget to include what your proposed resolution or remediation is, who is responsible, and the time frame in which that remediation will take place. It's another best practice to make sure you review that information with either the audit coordinator or a senior leadership team member to just make sure that they're aware and that they agree with disclosing that particular issue. What you do not want to do is wait for the auditor to show up and then turn around and say, oh, by the way, we know we have these issues. So self-identified audit issues can be very useful, but you have to be very good about the documentation in the plan to remediate the issue. Otherwise, it's just going to be another audit finding. I hope that's helpful.
On your screen now, you will see the poll results. Thanks again, everyone, for taking the time to answer the poll. Before continuing, I would like to direct your attention to our third-party risk management audit or regulatory exam checklist in the related content widget. Check out this resource for what to do when the auditors are coming for a visit. Hillary, back to you.
So back to the exam process. The auditors went home, and now we're waiting on the report. So how did we do? Well, first of all, I can tell you, don't expect a perfect score because findings are inevitable. Because frankly, an auditor isn't really doing their job if they can't add some value. So someone paid them to come look closely and evaluate your program and ideally make it better. So you should always expect there's going to be some findings. But when you have your findings, you enter the remediation phase of the exam. So in order to be truly actionable, the findings have to be written clearly so that the problem and the proposed resolution can be addressed effectively. So keep in mind that it's not an auditor's job to tell you how to fix an issue. In most cases, they will not. Most of the time, your organization has to respond to the findings in the documented report detailing your proposed remediation. That gets sent to the auditor or examiner, and if they don't find that proposed remediation or it's not appropriate or it's going to take too long, believe me, they're going to let you know. So what's most important here is that you respond to your findings with a smart remediation plan. You need to start with the specifics of the remediation, detail exactly what you're going to do to fix or solve the problem. Now, the next thing is, how do you measure that? Well, what evidence can you provide back to those auditors that you have, in fact, changed the process or remediated the problem? The next thing is really important. Is it attainable? So before we commit to a path, do we know that we can actually do it? We need to think about what's going to be required to make it happen, and if those changes are within our power, jurisdiction, and resources. Now, the next thing is realistic. So is this remediation realistic? So what if your organization doesn't really have any proof of a process? You're going to have to develop that new process, and they're going to have to be communicated as that process is established and rolled out, and that could take some time. And when it comes to time, when can you do it? If you're out of budget for the year and you can't get started on some of these positions until next year, assuming you have the right resources and budget, maybe the beginning of the year is so busy for other reasons that you can't commit to it till the second quarter of next year. Whatever it is, you have to be specific about the timing. And again, if they don't like it, they're going to let you know. Do remember that just like we expect of our vendors, every finding needs a response. Some of them may seem very nitpicky or irrelevant, but don't get too caught up in that because sometimes the only findings you have are going to be like that. So just take it as a compliment you're doing your job. Now, make sure that you give an honest response to how you can make the necessary changes and provide that timeline for when they can be accomplished. And I like to say, just feel free to give yourself a little bit of wiggle room here if you can. Now, I realize this doesn't always seem like an option because regulators are regulators. But if they come back and say, you need to have this implemented within 60 days, and you can't possibly do that, it's going to go one of two ways. One, you agree to the findings and risk the chance of overextending your resources, you make hasty decisions, and then you start failing to meet the deadlines, or even worse, slow rolling them because you're struggling to provide adequate remediation evidence. Or you can be honest up front about what our capabilities are and come up with a practical and attainable plan for how that issue can be remediated or that control can be implemented. You can present that as a response to the examiner's recommendation. So I'll leave you to decide which option is going to build more confidence between you and your regulators. And also, sometimes your findings might seem more like recommendations, and frankly, it may not necessarily make sense for you to implement because it's going to take more resources to do that than what the exposed risk is by not doing it. So sometimes it is okay to simply explain that in your response. So something along the lines of thanks for the recommendation, we'll take it into consideration, but otherwise we accept the risk. Again, if they have a problem, they'll let you know. All right, yay, now you're done. Examiners went home, you've responded to all your findings, we have some practical win-win remediation plans, progress is on time. Just a few things to keep in mind as you move forward. First of all, document how the whole process went down. If there was evidence that was really hard to gather, figure out how you can adjust your processes to create a better audit trail. Pay attention to what the auditors are saying, not just in their findings, but in the questions they ask you. It will help you understand their overall view of your big picture. And finally, don't expect there to be the same auditors next time, because there won't be. And more importantly, keep all this documentation as if you and your whole team are not going to be around for the next one. Because let's be honest, turnover is a very real and regular part of our corporate environments these days. And the best, most successful departments are those that leave a map for the ones that fill our shoes.
We are to our last poll question of the day, and that is, how confident do you feel about your next audit or exam? You're confident, processes are well documented, you have evidence for key deliverables, internal compliance is good, and open issues are well managed. Okay, most processes are documented, and you have evidence for critical vendor, third-party risk management deliverables. Internal compliance is pretty good. There are some known issues or program gaps, but documented plans are in place to manage them. You're nervous, not all processes are documented, evidence for deliverables is poor, and internal compliance is lacking, or issues are not remediated on time or at all, or you're not sure. Hillary, here's a question that is coming from the audience that I think we have some time to answer.
All right.
All righty. We are just starting our third-party risk management program and already have an audit scheduled. What should we do?
Lucky you. No, seriously, there's two questions I would ask up front. Is the audit a result of a previous finding? So let's say in a previous audit, someone said, hey, you don't have a program, and now they're following up on that. If that is the case, you shouldn't worry. You should get ready to have the audit and prepare all your materials appropriately with the knowledge that they're probably looking to confirm progress or adequate progress in the program. If there hasn't been any previous issue that's leading to the audit, it would be a good idea to inform your senior leadership that you're just starting, and so the audit may not yield that many results or may not be the best use of the auditor's time. In whichever case, don't be afraid of audits. They really are to help your business, and your program be the best that it can be. But it's really a good idea to make sure that auditors understand where you are in the process, and if there's nothing to show yet, that just may not be the best use of their time. So I'd discuss it with your senior leaders and proceed from there.
And here are those results. Thank you, everyone, for answering this question. Before we move on, we have our vendor sites visit checklist and infographic in the related content widget. This checklist and infographic will help you prepare for a site visit at your vendor's business. Let's continue with the presentation. Back to you, Hillary.
All right, I wanted to share a short story about my experience with the regulatory exam, and I think it can be really beneficial. So early in my third-party risk career, I was scheduled to be part of a regulatory exam, and I was getting interviewed by the examiner. And I was really nervous because this was my first exam. And I felt a lot like that kid who gets called into the principal's office. But once I met the examiner, he was very professional. He had a list of questions that I could confidently answer. And I was feeling pretty good about everything until he started asking me questions that really weren't about third-party risk management at all. And then he started asking me if I had evidence to support a process that I wasn't responsible for and I really didn't know much about. And then he wanted to know who was responsible for X, Y, Z, and I just got very frustrated, and I finally said, I'm sorry, I just don't know. And he kind of laughed a little bit, and he said, I know you don't, and that's okay. And then he explained to me, hey, this is your first exam. Let me give you some tips to help you in the future. So let me share those with you. First, every person who's scheduled to be interviewed by the examiner should have a prep session with the exam coordinator or a senior manager. And those sessions should include a review of all documents and other evidence that are being provided to the examiner. They should also cover the scope and focus of the exam and if there were any issues requiring attention from a previous exam. So get that information before you walk in the door. The coordinator should also specify if specific topics are best handled by a certain person. For example, if there are decisions that are usually handled at the board level, questions related to those decisions are best left to senior management or actual board members. You know, if you're aware of a known issue, say you have a process that doesn't work or has a lot of exceptions, it's recommended that you discuss those issues with the exam coordinator to determine if documenting a self-identified issue or an SIA would be appropriate. So for those that aren't familiar, self-identified issues, it's the process of formally documenting a known issue, providing specific remediation steps, including the timing and who's responsible for fixing it. And by the way, if you're going to do that, please do that ASAP. Do not wait until all the documents have already been sent to the examiner or bring it up in the middle of the interview. And if an examiner should ask questions that are out of scope for you, speak up. It's fine to say, I don't have enough information about that, or I think so-and-so would be the right person to answer your question. And if you don't know the answer, don't guess. Just be honest and say you don't know. And finally, he suggested that you read the regulatory exam handbooks to get familiar with the process. So I hope that little story was helpful. Let's talk about some regulation that is still out there. So last year, in July, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors and the OCC, they issued this big press release saying that they were going to, they were proposing new interagency guidance. Now, the issue is that we have had no updates on this guidance, and if guidance eventually becomes official, all other agency guidance is going to be replaced. And for those that are already familiar with the OCC's 2013 guidance, you're going to recognize that it's a lot of the same content. So make sure that you keep your eye on this one, but until it becomes official, you'll need to follow your existing guidance. Another thing we have to be aware of in this, ongoing pandemic, post-pandemic world is that there's hybrid exams and audits. So during the initial stages of the pandemic, they really weren't doing them, and then they were kind of moving to a more virtual environment. But anything can change at any time. So for that reason, we need to be prepared for any type of audit or exam that we're approached with. So that means that if your auditors are conducting audits remotely, there's got to be more dependence on documentation. And that means you have to document everything. Anything that changes, write about it somewhere, even if it's explained in an archived email. If there are any process steps that are skipped because of the current situation, then you need to document why. And when the inevitable audit rolls around, and they will, examiners are going to want to see if you're handling any new risks and process changes effectively. Even if you're doing everything right, if it's not documented, it didn't happen or doesn't exist. So keep that in mind when you are called for a virtual or remote audit. Well, here we are at the end of another boot camp, and it has been an awesome one. We've covered so much information over the last 3 days. Just a few quick highlights. We looked at that new third-party risk management lifecycle. We looked at the 3 stages, including onboarding, ongoing, and offboarding. We've had our subject matter experts share their wisdom and expertise on interpreting your vendor's financial information and information security reports. We've looked at stock reporting and business continuity management. And we've looked at all the activities in the offboarding stage, including the exit plan, execution, and third-party risk management closure. And we provided information to help you feel more confident and prepared before an audit or exam. So I hope this was helpful for everyone. Thank you for your attention today. And now I'm going to pass it back to Jesse for closing remarks and some more Q&A.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. Before we dive into more questions and answers, I would like to thank everyone for attending our third and final day of boot camp. We appreciate your participation, engagement, and questions. I would also like to thank our experts from today, Greg and Hillary, for their time in sharing some important information on offboarding and governance. On your screen now, you will see our upcoming webinars. On October 18th, we will be hosting 2 webinars, the first at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, covering vetting your vendor's cybersecurity preparedness, and at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we'll dive further into the topic covering how to review a vendor's cybersecurity. We hope you will be able to join us for those sessions. A link to register for these are in your copy of today's presentation slides. Let's now go ahead and answer some more questions that have come in during this session. Okay, Greg, this next question will go to you. Can you talk more about revoking physical access, as that is a new concept for me in vendor offboarding?
Sure. Well, physical access refers to human resources that can enter your locations. So this could be consulting staff with access to general work area, could be IT-related staff with access to data centers, or even think about construction and janitorial services. So just like disconnecting your infrastructure from vendor systems and having that have been integrated, right, and ensuring the data was disposed of properly, these human resources pose risk, and their access should be reviewed as part of your procedures and final checklist to ensure no further unapproved access can occur. Now, in terms of turnaround time and stakeholders to involve, this really could vary. So you should look to identify this and understand it in advance. Engage HR, facilities, security, or whomever would process these requests for revoking physical access, and do this as part of developing your offboarding process. Hopefully that's helpful. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Greg. Hillary, we'll come to you for this next question.
Okay.
All right. We don't have a risk committee or a board of directors, so should be getting the report.
So a good rule of thumb to follow is that your most senior level of management should be providing that oversight function for your third-party risk management program. So no board, that's your C-level executive team, CEO, COO, et cetera. Definitely want to make sure that there is at least acknowledgement that you've provided the information. Ultimately, through regulations and best practices, those individuals are going to be held accountable if something's not right with the program. So just take it to the highest level of management in your company.
Great. Thanks so much, Hillary. As we know everyone's time is very valuable, we are going to pause on questions for just a moment to cover some important follow-up items to be aware of as we wrap up this hour. However, if you have time and would like to stay around longer to hear some more answers, we will continue questions and answers for a few more questions in just a moment. And don't forget, you can ask even more questions and access thousands of educational resources inside of our third-party think tank, an online community that is dedicated to third-party risk professionals and free to join. We did record each day of the boot camp, and those recording links will be provided to you in a follow-up email that you will receive tomorrow afternoon. Also in that follow-up email will be the survey link for you to request the CPE credits. Thank you all for all of our experts to another great boot camp, and thank you to everyone in our audience for taking the time to listen in. If you submitted a question but can't stick around, don't worry, we will follow up with you via email. We will now continue for a few extra minutes to answer some more questions that have came in. And Hillary, we'll come back to you for this one.
Okay.
Do we have to calculate residual risk?
You know, you don't necessarily. Some of the regulations say that that's an expectation. You got to keep in mind, you know, residual risk is not a risk rating, but it's a measure of how effective your controls are. And especially when you're just starting out a program, you may not have the bandwidth or the methodology to go ahead and figure that out. It's not an absolute must for everyone, but be aware of what your regulatory requirements are if you have them. And then it is a good idea to work towards being able to get that residual risk rating when you can, because it can help you show how much risk you've actually reduced, not only at the vendor level, but at the portfolio level. So use your guidance, your regulatory guidance, to answer a firm yes or no. But if you're not there yet, it's not the end of the world. Just work on getting there as you can.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Greg, we'll come back to you for this one. Are there ways to avoid vendor termination fees?
Well, two ideas come to mind here. The best way, first and foremost, is via strong contract language. Ensure your contract includes clear and appropriate language so both parties understand and accept what will happen if there's a need to terminate the relationship. The risk is, if your termination rights aren't clearly defined, it's more unlikely that your organization can actually smoothly break the contract because of issues like performance or breaches or other non-compliance issues. So review the air quote right to terminate conditions. Examples here are termination for cause. You could consider termination for convenience. And don't forget to review notification periods and discuss the termination fees. But beyond contracts, really document everything. So we both mentioned it today. Issues management is your friend, especially as it relates to this topic. Having the evidence of a one-time or worse yet, a recurring issue helps validate termination and can help avoid these fees and disputes.
Great, thanks, Greg. Hillary, back to you for this one.
Okay.
Should we provide the full data reports with the third-party risk management board report?
Generally, no. With your board reports, you've got to keep in mind that they're going to have reporting decks that are hundreds of pages long. And we do want to encourage the board and those folks to look at it. And the best way to do that is to provide a condensed version, a dashboard with an executive summary, for example. And you can reference on that executive summary that the full reports are available via whatever channel. But don't include like a 100-page report with your board report. It just won't work out well for anyone.
Great, thanks, Hillary. And Greg, back to you for this one. Can you reiterate the regulatory expectations for exit planning?
Yes. So in general, you will see a lot of consistent expectations, whether it's the proposed interagency guidance on third-party relationships that Hillary mentioned, or EBA guidelines on outsourcing arrangements out in Europe. So these, for example, state exit and contingency plans are risk-based. So the emphasis largely across these regulatory bodies, what they share is that it's about critical and high-risk vendors. That's their shared target. Next, as we stated today, a validated and tested plan should be in place really for day one of utilizing the product and service to avoid material operational impact. So that obviously requires planning and testing in advance of you starting to use said product and service. And also they share expectations around plan objectives and roles being well defined This leads towards a strong test and eventual implementation of the exit plan. But as always, as we said here today, refer to your own body and review their nuanced requirements with respect to termination and exit. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Greg. Unfortunately, that is all the time we have left for questions today. Thank you to Greg and Hillary for answering some more of those. On behalf of VinMinder, it has been a pleasure. Have a great rest of your day.